Hello, everybody, and welcome to Let's Talk Climate. Thank you for joining. I'm Bob Perkowitz. Before we get started, a couple of housekeeping items. We invite you to share the conversation online with the hashtag Let's Talk Climate, and you can join the conversation that we're having here right now using the chat functions. Just hit all attendees and type your question in. Staff at ecoAmerica will be feeding the questions to us, so at any time ask a question. And we also have people available to help you with any technical issues. So if you have a problem, type that into the chat window as well. And finally, I want to let you know that this session is being recorded and it will be available on demand online. So you're being recorded with everything that you say. Today, we're going to be talking about leadership amidst COVID-19. All of us recognize that we do have leadership challenges in this country, and Jerry Teller and Bill Becker are here to help us guide our way through them. So I'm going to kick it off right away with a question for Bill. And Bill, you have led the Presidential Climate Action Project over the last few election cycles and produced plans on climate change for the incoming administrations. We seem to have been making good progress on climate change, and then this COVID thing happened. How do you think the COVID situation is going to play into the politics of climate change in this election cycle?
Well, I think the last election, presidential election, was probably one of the most surprising ones. This one, I think, is one of the most volatile ones. There's so many factors that can change in these few months before the election. Of course, this started out to be one of the first climate, or perhaps the first climate election, where it was on everyone's radar. And we're going to have to see whether that's eclipsed, whether the sense of importance the public has about climate change is eclipsed by the COVID outbreak. So we have to figure out, will the economy be recovering by November? Will they be seeing things getting better? Or will we have another outbreak in the fall, as some doctors predict? Will voters really understand the link between climate change and a pandemic like this, which I think is going to be very important? And what will the weather be? If you're talking about climate change, bad weather tends to be your ally in terms of public opinion. This hurricane season is supposed to be very active. And NOAA says there's going to be 128 million Americans flooded this spring. We'll see if that happens. But that's a factor that we can't predict. So I think there's a lot of messages that the Democratic president candidate can give. And I think, as we'll talk about later, I think that Biden could be stronger and more assertive in his climate action plan, because if he links the COVID crisis to climate change and shows how they're similar, and especially in terms of delay and denial and what that means and how deadly that can be.
Okay. And Jerry, just to get the things kicked off with you, it's good to see you. I've always thought that you have had one of the toughest jobs in America, which is selling climate change to conservatives. And the way you're doing that is by putting a price on carbon, which some people might call a tax. Has COVID affected your strategy and what you're doing at Niskanen Center at all?
Yeah, our main audience at Niskanen are the legislators on Capitol Hill, their senior staff and committee staff. So we're directly engaged in the blocking and tackling and trying to move legislation and educate members and that sort of thing. You don't really have to work that hard to convince Republicans that climate change is real, at least when we meet them behind the scenes. It's not quite what you'd expect. They're just not entirely sure what policy ought to be, what sort of policy is consistent with their conservative Republican bona fides, and there's no real window of opportunity for them right now. If they were to step out and become moderately ambitious climate actors, there's no chance of moving legislation past Donald Trump's desk. There's no chance of passing it in a McConnell Senate. They just put a target on their backs and flag the Coke machine to come get them. So our job has largely been about education and then helping to encourage a positive, meaningful policy response if and when that window opens. So how has COVID affected that? Well, COVID's taken all the oxygen in the room. I mean, you have a conversation with a legislator now about climate change. It's obviously going to be with the staffer who's got a lot of time on his hands. Right now, everything is about COVID 24/7. But that actually works to our advantage in one very important way that Bill kind of touched on a moment ago, and I'll underscore his point. What the COVID-19 crisis is the climate crisis in hyperspeed. We're seeing it all in real time. And we're seeing the wages of ignoring scientific experts, the wages of hand-waving risk warnings over and over and over again, the wages of listening to people who are denialists in this world and trying to tell us that up is down, black is white, night is day. We're seeing the body counts pile up right now because of that behavior. And oddly enough, almost every single person I know from my own world of climate skepticism, the people who've been peddling climate denialism in the Republican Party for all these years, are also the most prominent COVID-19 deniers. And I think in the long run, that is going to destroy them, and it's going to really cripple their movement. So what we're trying to do is to make the case to Republicans that this is not the hill you want to die on. And when this COVID-19 crisis is over, it will be a scarring experience for a generation. These scarring experiences tend to have narratives around them. So the scarring experience of the Great Depression, the narrative that the public learned was that the government just doesn't work best on autopilot. It needs management from the federal government. We had a scarring experience with Pearl Harbor. What was the takeaway from that? What was the learned message? Well, we can't allow dictators to rise without opposition around the world. I mean, whether you like those narratives or not, they influence policy for generations to come. COVID-19 is going to do the same. And what is the narrative that will accompany COVID-19? It's going to be about the dangers of hand-waving risks, the dangers of ignoring scientists, the dangers of just like whistling past graveyards, even though we've had decade after decade of warning that this gray rhino was coming. It's the same thing with climate change. And that's what we're hoping to hammer home to our audience on the Hill.
So on the negative side, we have COVID and the economic contraction taking all the oxygen out of the room. On the positive side, if you're outside at all, the air is a lot cleaner and the water is a lot cleaner than you've ever seen in your lives. People are getting views that they haven't seen in a lifetime. And then on the other hand, too, we always said that it's too expensive to address climate change. And now $1 trillion is almost like pocket change, right? And so it seems like there's a couple of great factors where COVID has moved society forward to climate solutions that might cost $1 trillion a year and that might really have benefits to your community. And so do you buy into any of that? Do you think that the clean air and the way that we're spending money right now might facilitate climate solutions?
You know, it's really hard to say it could go either way because this is a two-edged sword. The right is making this point vigorously now, which is, yeah, we're getting CO2 emissions reductions and we're seeing clearer skies in cities and reduced fossil fuel consumption at a horrendous cost. And so they're trying to use this, and you know, and they're not wrong to say on the right that even with all of the emissions reductions that have followed from this economic collapse, it's still not on a pace, on a sustained year by year by year basis to hit zero emissions by 2050. And so what they're trying to argue, wrongly in my opinion, but what they're trying to argue is that these are the economic costs that would follow from any emissions reduction strategy to meet environmentalist targets for climate change. And so, you know, obviously this isn't the way we'd go about it, but I think the climate actors have to be careful about getting too enthusiastic about the silver linings on the clouds that we see from environmental improvements associated with COVID-19.
Yeah, Bob, I think one thing that's going to be curious to watch is whether people have more or less confidence in federal government's activism. I'm thinking about FDR after the Depression and how the federal government came away looking pretty good in terms of saving the country. I don't know if that's going to be the case because of the denial factor we mentioned, but it could be that the country sees a stronger role for the federal government, is not quite so afraid of it, for better or for worse. The other thing I'd point out real quickly is that in terms of trusting science, we don't have to trust the predictions anymore because we've got the facts in front of us. We have 47 million Americans exposed to extreme weather right now per year, at least once per year. We had $1.75 trillion worth of climate losses since climate-induced losses since 1980. We have an average, you see me reading my notes, an average of 14 mega disasters every year compared to 65 over the last 20 years. So there's a lot going on out there in terms of weather and weather disasters and climate impacts, although they're early and they're going to get much worse.
Okay, well, we are in an election cycle right now, and the progressives have just gone through a battle with Bernie and Elizabeth on one side, and Biden and the moderates on the other side, and the moderates seem to have won. Do you think how is the pandemic going to affect them? They may not be that aggressive on climate change up front, and now they've got the pandemic. So what do you think Biden's going to do on climate? Bill?
Was that for Jerry?
Nope, for you.
Oh, well, as I said earlier, I think it's going to enable him to be a little more aggressive. I'm not sure the moderates have won. They have in a sense, but I think Biden is showing signs of trying to fold in the progressive angles on climate change, certainly. And then one signal is the panel, the advisory panel he named, which has AOC on it. It could well be, if he makes the case correctly and he messages this well, and shows how climate change is much more serious, long-lasting, permanent, irreversible, there is no vaccine for it, than COVID has been. I think he'll give himself license to be more aggressive on climate change and to make the point we can't afford to be patients anymore. Congress hasn't done anything significant on this since 1992, for crying out loud, and we don't have any time. So if he messages it well, I think he can be more aggressive.
Okay. Jerry, I don't think we disagree that the administration is rolling back a lot of regulations, and especially now using COVID as a cover, they're doing even more, just blanket any regulation that's going to slow down the economy they're trying to kill. How are we going to, is that how you see things, and how are we going to undo that kind of damage?
You undo it by electing Joe Biden and reversing course. I mean, this is the bright side of the Trump rollback. What presidents can do at EPA, other presidents can undo at EPA. In fact, I doubt losing 4 years in climate policy is a big deal given how little time we have to address this problem before the worst risks come to roost. But that having been said, since nothing has been accomplished on the regulatory front with legislation, it means what was done can be undone. And so electing Joe Biden and aggressive regulators at EPA who can move quickly is of critical importance. The real problem here, though, is that the federal judiciary is now increasingly stacked with Federalist Society Trump judges. And regulatory action by EPA, while in theory is something we want to embrace if we can't have market-oriented policies, most certainly. It's not obvious to me that regulatory action by EPA is going to deliver as near as many of the goods as a lot of climate actors think, because you can't wish away a whole bunch of Brett Kavanaughs. And these guys are loaded for bear.
We've got a question from the audience, Jerry, about Republicans and, the denial you were talking about used to be on climate. The same denialists are denying that COVID is a big problem. Is there any way to get beyond Republican denialism at all?
I think so. The thing is, what the denialists are discrediting themselves in real time. I mean, for instance, my brother, you may not know this, James Taylor, is the head of Heartland Institute now, biggest denialist operations. And I've been telling him privately, you should be staying away from COVID denialism. I'm not trying to, tell you how to run a better denialist think tank, but getting associated with that is going to destroy you and destroy your credibility. And he doesn't listen. So the fact is, he's kind of doing my job for me, because all you have to do is point to them and say, look, these are the same people who told you that, this is no worse than the cold. We don't have to do anything. This is overwrought, and they're being discredited in real time. So with a lot of Republican actors, there's a split. Some of them really do want to address climate change. They are really concerned about the future. They're, again, not sure what the right policy vehicle is. They're not sure when the window of opportunity will be there for them, but they are interested in that in a meaningful conversation. About the other half of those who are not very comfortable with the orthodoxy in the party, they're not really all that interested in climate change, but they're scared to death of the electoral outcomes of ignoring it. Now, no Republicans lost their job yet in an election because they were climate denialists, and they all know that, but they're all scared that that day is about to come. And the fact Republicans increasingly can't find votes in suburbs because they can't attract millennials, they can't attract college educated voters, they can't attract women, and these are people who have, relatively higher salience for climate policy. does concern them. So they're looking for a policy that can allow them to compete again in the suburbs. Climate is a great issue because what else are they going to do to compete better in the suburbs? Throw the NRA out of the bus? Are they going to turn on the evangelicals? No, I mean, but this is an easier one for them to execute. The question is, will their relatively anemic policy messaging responses be enough to allow them to compete in the suburbs? Some of them think so. I'm pretty darn skeptical. So there's two reasons why Republicans may very well, if not today, but tomorrow, come around and be somewhat more responsible on climate. One is electoral reality forcing their hand and forcing them into a better position. And the other is that if and when Donald Trump exits stage right from the GOP, there are people in the Republican Party who would like to act, but they can't act with him there. So the real opening for them will be to what extent does Trump still have a hold on the GOP after November if he loses. It's not obvious to me which way that'll play out. He could have almost a continuing death grip on the party with a Twitter feed and his own network from afar, or he may face the ignominy of Jimmy Carter. I mean, most in American politics, if you lose a national election, you lose it pretty cleanly. You're generally not a very influential actor in the party thereafter. But, you know, he's sui generis, so we'd have to say.
How are you calling the election now?
Well, we have a pretty robust staff that deals with issues beyond climate change. We also deal a lot with political science and forecasting and elections. Our senior fellow, Rachel Bitecofer, has released some forecasts. We're calling it, unless there's some exogenous event that we can't imagine right now, it's a pretty heavily favored Democratic win for Joe Biden. Democrats hold the House, obviously, and it's a coin toss for the Senate with a slight advantage that they might have. So I'm fairly bullish on a pretty reasonably large blue wave of the kind we saw in the off years of 2017, the midterms of 2018, and the off years of 2019.
Yeah, most of the pollsters are with you on that. The bookies are going the other direction. So we'll see what happens there. Bill, there's the COVID thing, and then there's the economic crisis that has happened. And last time we went through an economic crisis, 2008, 2009, the federal government did a stimulus program that you could say created Tesla. They loaned them hundreds of millions of dollars, created the battery industry, created the wind industry, just moved us forward in a dramatic fashion on all things climate. Probably the biggest stimulus on climate that we've had. And we're not doing that this time. Right now, we're just throwing money at the problem in a variety of different ways. And so the question is there any way that we can, reverse that leverage either before or after the next election and use the economic stimulus to help us move forward on climate?
Well, there should be. And I think the folks who are concerned about climate action are pretty disenchanted right now with the speaker because the stimulus packages that have come out so far have not addressed green technologies or climate change. And as you pointed out, that $90 billion allocation that was made by the Trump or the Obama administration really had some results. So we're going to see, I think the speaker is promising that there's going to be an element for the climate action community in a future bill if one passes. But I think that one thing I mentioned messaging, I think it's real important for everyone involved here to frame climate action, not in environmental terms right now, but in terms of jobs and economic stability, because I think that's going to be on people's minds for the rest of this campaign season. So Biden, for example, has to point out that you get much more bang for the buck from investment in green technologies than you do in fossil fuels, for example. McKinsey and I would recommend everybody take a look at this. McKinsey just came out with its own plan for how to stimulate climate change at the same time or climate action at the same time you stimulate the economy. And it pointed out for a $10 million investment, you can get 75 renewable energy jobs, 77 energy efficiency jobs, but only 27 fossil energy jobs. Before this thing began, we had 3.4 million people working in this clean energy sector. We've lost about 600,000 as of mid-May. So obviously, that sector needs stimulus. The last stimulus bill, by the way, had some relief for the marijuana industry, but not for green technologies. And so I think we need to pressure Congress to pay attention to this sector. It's much more productive, I think, than the fossil energy sector, especially at this point. That fossil energy sector is in some trouble right now.
Well, if you take a look at where climate is as an election issue, and you look at the Democrats, it's coming in as a number 1 or 2, or at the lowest, a number 3 issue. And on the Republican side, it's coming down, as toward the middle or more toward the bottom. And so just overall in this election, and this is for either of you guys, how do you think climate is going to play into the election? Will it be a big issue, or will it be shut aside by economy, COVID, healthcare issues, things like that?
Well, I'll be a little heterodox here. I think it'll play a role in the campaign, not a central role, but a supporting role. I mean, the central role will be COVID-19, again, sucking out all the oxygen in the room, and rightly so. But it will be a peripheral issue. But I suspect it will be more because Republicans are trying to take the offensive rather than Democrats trying to take the offensive on this. Republicans in the before times, before this crisis hit, had planned a campaign against Joe Biden, or whoever got the nomination, as a Green New Deal lunatic who wants to bring in socialism, central planning, and command and control economics to destroy free market capitalism. And the Green New Deal was the center and circumference of that entire charge. So it's one of the reasons why Republicans want to talk about climate, because they're going to want to put the Green New Deal around Joe Biden's neck and say, look at Ocasio-Cortez and these advisory groups and the rest of them, they're drafting the Green New Deal up, and Biden's embraced it. And that's what's coming your way, the end of capitalism and all of that. I don't think that's going to work, but I think the Republicans are going to try it. They've invested a lot in it. They don't really have anything else anymore, save for a tax and vilification. I think that for the Democratic side, it probably remains to be seen, but my guess is that Joe Biden will talk about climate change in the context of COVID-19 as an example of an even worse catastrophe that awaits us if we don't act in the course of rebuilding our economy post-COVID in a way that could sustain climate change and address it in a meaningful fashion to reduce risk. I think that's probably as far as he'd go, but we'll have to see. They don't send me their campaign memos.
What do you think, Bill?
Well, I think that, as I said, I think that he has to be careful how he frames whatever they're putting together on climate change as a jobs program, as an economic stimulus, as an economic stability, and talk about what will happen if we don't start paying attention to climate change. We don't have much time left. I would stress less the social equity side, although that's part and parcel with a good economy. I'd stress less the environmental side, although again, that's part and parcel of a good climate program. So he's got to pay attention to what's on people's minds. And as Jerry said, I think it's going to be COVID, it's going to be the loss of jobs, instability of the economy, and all the side effects that we're seeing from this pandemic. And again, I think a big thing is going to be how the pandemic plays out, because there are doctors and medical people saying that we're going to have another resurgence of this virus in the fall when the weather gets a little bit cooler. And if that happens, these job and economic issues are going to be front and center, as well as freedom issues on people's minds.
One of you said earlier about the storms and other things affecting the electorate, and I have a tendency of thinking that in the next 3 or 4 months, that a lot of people have gotten climate change because of the wildfires, because of the hurricanes, because of the flooding. That the reality of it is way different from the hypothetical science thing that we all had to talk about 10 years ago. And so, what's going to happen in the next 3 or 4 months? And do you think that the situations God's will in terms of controlling fires and floods and the impact of climate change, do you think that could have a big impact on the election?
It could, but so far, climate impacts from extreme weather events and that sort of thing haven't moved public opinion at all. I mean, Robert Brule is a sociologist at Brown. He's done great research on this. And as much as you would think that rising temperatures and hurricanes and extreme weather events associated with climate change would move public opinion, especially if you lived in Houston or something, it doesn't. But that doesn't mean it never will. And I think last year was sort of a break in the trends. I mean, after all, Australia nearly burned to a crisp. And before that, California nearly burned down. And we now have an increasingly likely severe hurricane season, where we know that climate change may not be increasing the number of hurricanes, but it's increasing the severity of high-end hurricanes and the frequency of them. If we get those if California burns again this summer and we get an epic hurricane season, and remember, we're also in the middle of about a 3 or 4 decade mega drought in the West that is going to continue to exponentially harm cause economic impacts there. That could be sort of the 1-2 punch that wakes a lot of people up and says, we're not just in a COVID crisis, we're in a climate crisis. We ignored warnings about the wages of not planning for a pandemic, and we're now paying the wages of not planning for climate change. So it could play an impact, but there's a lot of variability to this.
There's a real case to be made, though. It depends on which poll you're reading. I think the stuff coming out of the Yale Climate Communications Program seems to indicate the weather is moving some people's opinion, the fear of it and the fear of what will happen to their children. But we need to keep making that link. And so there's a new branch of science called attribution science that is gaining confidence in attributing how much of a natural disaster is attributed to climate change. So we need to make those linkages. But we're setting records all the time in heat. We're setting records in floods. We're setting records in hurricanes and fires, and just records are toppling right and left. And this is pretty a good case, I think, to make that we're in real jeopardy from these kinds of weather-related events from climate change. And it's going to get a whole lot worse unless we act on it now.
Well, from our own polling 4 years ago, 27% of Americans said they were very concerned about climate change. And our polling that we did at the end of last year said 54% of them were. And if you look at the Pew Public Policy Priorities or the Gallup polls, you see this steady increase in people's concern about climate change in America. And Jerry, if you don't think that it's the weather and the fires and the storms that are moving people, what is moving people toward that greater level of concern?
Well, that's the interesting answer that Bob Brule tries to produce in his work, and it's not just Brule, but others who've looked at what correlates with changes in public opinion and climate change. And what he finds, and I find it very persuasive, is that what's moving public opinion are what they're hearing from trusted elites. Democratic opinion on climate change is pretty steady and stable. It doesn't move around very much, a little bit, but not that much. It's Republican opinions that move around a bit. And they're the ones which can be affected by time and events. And Republican opinion on climate change moves around more than you think. And after doing regression analyses, Brule and others have found that the main determinant about what informs Republican opinion on climate change, at least mass opinion outside of Washington, just your average voter, is what they're hearing from political leaders. When Republican political leaders are people like John McCain, who's talking about climate issues, Republican concern goes up. When it's Donald Trump, who's a lunatic, it goes down. But when there's general silence and they're not hearing much about the issue, there's an endogenous increase in concern about climate change, even on the right, because it's hard to ignore everything else going on around you as far as like Australia burning down, massive epic fires in California, flooding of New York City and Houston. That stuff is like background noise that continues to move Republican opinion somewhat. In other words, it's hard to deny it's happening at this point. And it's only when they hear a lot from their trusted, chieftains in the party that those numbers move down a little bit. But basically, again, it's what they're hearing from political elites. In other words, what's Rush Limbaugh talking about? What's Laura Ingraham talking about? What's Sean Hannity talking about? What's Vladimir Putin talking about? I mean, those are the things that have a lot of impact on public opinion. On the left,
the same thing, Jerry, and I think that you're correct. Climate change is one of the most complicated issues we've had to deal with ever. And so I think people tend to trust their opinion leaders more because people don't understand it themselves. Right. They trust that their opinion leaders do. So that's very important. And one of the great disappointments to me has been how silent those Republicans you've talked about have been on this issue in Congress. There's, as you know, a number of organizations, including yours, who are on the right side, what I consider the right side of this issue, who are conservative or right of center groups and are trying to move the needle on this. And I wish they had a better stage and microphone than they have as well. Young Republicans especially are getting into this and trying to influence their peers on the Hill. But the people on the Hill who believe that we need to do something need to have the courage to speak up. And I realize it's hazardous. I realize that the fossil energy industry is a big influence. But they can't keep in lockstep with a guy who's denying that this problem even exists and is in fact rolling back all the tools we have to address it. They can't stay lockstep with that guy. So I hope they get a little more courage than they've had so far and come out of the closet on this.
Well, I do too. And we're certainly trying to give them a dose of that courage. But it's important to remember not all elite voices are created equal. Pat Rooney is a tremendous congressman from Florida, Republican, who's co-sponsored carbon tax legislation, which is actually meaningfully ambitious. It's not just a messaging bill. We worked with him on that legislation. Hasn't saved him any. I mean, he hasn't changed a whole lot of Republican opinion by doing so. Brian Fitzpatrick's another good Republican on that front. How much impact has he had on public opinion in the GOP? Not that much. Unfortunately, the way this world works is that Sean Hannity has more influence than all these Republican congressmen and senators combined times 5, as does Tucker Carlson and the various other talking heads and bloviards on talk radio, and Donald Trump himself. So while it would be nice to hear more members speaking up, I'm not entirely sure, and there's a lot of virtue in that, so we're trying to encourage it, but I don't think having members in the House and the Senate speak up more often is going to have much of an impact on mass opinion in the GOP ranks. Now, the happy end of that story is I don't think that mass opinion in the GOP ranks is anywhere near as critical as a lot of people think it is towards driving climate action in the GOP. Public opinion does not correlate very well with policy change. Public opinion can stop policy change, but it can't force policy change. If it could, we would have gun control laws all over the place, right? I mean, most people support gun control laws, but it doesn't change public policy, right? Because minorities can hold choke points.
Jerry, you mentioned a couple of statements ago that trusted elites were the people that had helped move the public toward concern and action on climate change. Here at ecoAmerica, those are the people we deal with. The people that are listening to this are health leaders, faith leaders, and community leaders. We've been working to help them talk about climate change and get their ministers, their nurses, their doctors out there to communicate to their local communities that climate change is a real issue and there's real consequences in not dealing with it. Do you have any recommendations for any of these professionals on what they should say to help? And you too, Bill, and what would you tell them to tell their patients or their congregations or their local city council? What would you tell them to say about climate change? What are the best messages?
Well, I think in regard to what we were just talking about in terms of trusted elites, perhaps doctors are a trusted elite that can counteract some of the message from the people who are irrational about this and that tend to be conspiratorial about climate action. Maybe their public accountants and their investment counselors can be elites who talk to them and give them a different message than they've been getting. We need maybe a better understanding of who people listen to and who the real influences are for different segments of the population, and engage them in this conversation. Because I think if we get to the personal level and also point out some of the craziness that people like Hannity and Limbaugh have tried to sell the public to undermine their credibility, maybe there's enough rationality out there for that to make a difference. But, it is amazing to me how many people don't believe in climate change, giving all the evidence, and follow the people who weave tales about climate change. It discourages me sometimes. I wonder how aware people in the voting public really are. So it's a big lift. There's no question about it. But again, I think the weather's on our side. I think the economics are on our side. I think the job creation is on our side. I think the don't delay because it's deadly is on our side. It all depends on how well we drive those points home.
Well, the big issue, I think, is less public sentiment for the need to address climate change, because that's been there. I mean, if you look at the polls and your objective is to try to build a critical mass of public support for climate action, we won that fight 2 decades ago. I mean, each of these polls find that public support for climate action is routinely topping 65% from the federal government. So it's not so much that, even if the public doesn't understand climate change very well, It's not that they're on balance opposed or skeptical about climate action. The problem is saliency. Relative to other concerns, climate change has always been near the bottom of the list. The big change in American politics in the past few elections, in the last couple of election cycles, is that climate change has risen in saliency in the Democratic Party, largely out of the progressive wing of the party, granted. But right now, I mean, during the campaign season, I would routinely see polls on almost a weekly basis that when trying to measure what are the most important issue to various segments of the Democratic primary base, amongst progressive Democrats, climate change was like number 1 or 2, depending upon when the poll was asked and where it was asked. I think the lowest it ever got was 3, but it was super high up on matters of concern. That had never been the case before. And so what's always crippled the environmental movement is really not lack of public support. It's lack of urgency. You know, climate change is always less important than this, that, or the other issue. And that may very well have changed now in the Democratic Party. I hope it has. And if it has changed, that gives me a lot of optimism. So to circle back to your question, Bob, of what your members can best do, rather than have PowerPoint debates with Sean Hannity lunacy or something, is just to point out how critically important this is. This, climate change is COVID-19 in slow motion, but the impacts are even worse. I mean, and there's no vaccine once we get into that world, because there's no, rewinding the clock and taking carbon out of the atmosphere on a rapid pace in a way we can afford. I mean, once we're in climate world, we're in climate world. And we need, in other words, and the policy response is the equivalent of finding a vaccine in advance. Because if we wait too late, we're going to be in this storm and there'll be no way out.
Yeah. The Republican Party has proposed planting trees and doing some things like that. Is there any seriousness in any of the proposals? Is any seriousness in the Republican Party anywhere for a program that might really address climate change?
Well, anywhere is a big statement. I can identify members in the House and the Senate who we've talked to, who I believe are fully aware of the scientific issues surrounding climate change, are fully convinced it's happening, fully convinced it is driven by anthropogenic emissions, and fully committed to finding a reasonable, economically viable solution. So there are some, but by and large, no. I mean, there's been a lot of attention given to about 36 Republicans working with Kevin McCarthy, the minority leader, to promote things like, as you said, Bob, tree planting and R&D projects and things like that. They are essentially messaging bills. They don't accomplish very much. They may be the best that could be passed in this Congress with Donald Trump in the White House. So it's quite possible this is the outer limits of politically viable responses to climate change in this time and in this place. So that's very possible. But some of those bills are actually things I'd vote for if I were a member. But they're by no means a serious policy response. At the end of the day, it's the beginning of finding a serious policy response. And my fear is that the people around Speaker McCarthy are less interested in acknowledging climate change as mainstream scientists understand it and understanding the urgency of action than they are of trying to solve a political problem, which is denialism in the suburbs. And if you look at their policy agenda and the rhetoric that they use, which is heavily accompanied by attacks on the Green New Deal and carbon pricing and, socialist, this, that, and the other, it's basically a resurrection of the 2002 Frank Luntz memo, which was famously written by a Republican pollster for the George W. Bush White House, in which he argued that naked opposition to climate action should be put aside. Opposition to climate action needs to be accompanied by this sort of blousy, Americans can innovate, and we'll research our way out of this with clean energy R&D, which ends up being a drop in the bucket and a happy talking point, because innovation fairies can't reliably save us, and we don't have time anyway, even if they could.
But if I may, the synapse fired from something Jerry just said. We have to recognize delay tactics as opposed to action tactics, and R&D is one of them. The fact is that we've heard this over and over again, we have the stuff we need to address this problem significantly right now. R&D is important for things like battery technologies and enabling technologies to use the technologies we have, like wind and solar, and so on. Wind and solar could always get better, but we have the tools right now, and they are cost effective right now, many of them. So there's no reason to delay. There's no reason to study the problem anymore. What we need to do is study how to act on the problem. So watch out for those delay tactics.
You know, there's been a lot in the press about how COVID was going to be the great equalizer, and it turns out it's not. It's affecting the most vulnerable communities. People of color, elderly people are getting hit much harder. And there's a lot of thought that that's the exact same thing that's going to happen to climate change. If you've got money, you can move, you can protect yourself. But if you don't, and the federal government takes away your insurance, so how do we, how important is it to embed justice? I don't want to use the word progressive values, but how important is it to embed those kinds of things into our climate solutions, or are they things that might hold back climate action?
You know, I'm conflicted. I think that the case made by those concerned about environmental justice is by and large correct. But on the other hand, the more this is seen as an ideological issue that divides the left and the right, the harder it is to envision a sustainable long-term answer. Because the bottom line is, you know, even if the Democrats have a great November, which I expect them to have, and they hold, the House, the Senate, the White House, and they're able to pass a regulatory regime, but it's basically through one party just muscling the other, that's not very sustainable. We're going to have to decarbonize over the course of several decades. What, are the Democrats going to hold the White House for the next 30 freaking years? No, Republicans will probably get back in the White House again someday. And under that scenario, they just roll this stuff right back. And if the climate campaign is premised heavily on frontline communities, the need to pursue social justice and all that, it contributes to this ideological cleavage between the two parties, which sees climate change as, or at least on the right, they see climate change as a stalking horse for socialism. Now, I don't think there's anything wrong with the phrase social justice, don't get me wrong. But for Republicans, there's virtually nothing you can say that can more alienate a Republican that we're going to pursue social justice. And it plays into the narrative that a lot of climate skeptics make, which is that these people aren't really interested in climate change. What they're really interested in is all the agenda items that get accompanied by climate change. The destruction of the fossil fuel industry, because they're really concerned about conventional air pollution. They're concerned about, the injustices of capitalism. And this is a way for them to address some of that. And that makes things very difficult for people like me. Now, again, I don't disagree with the social justice narrative, but politics is about winning. It's not about the self-indulgence.
Yeah, I think there's going to be a pressure point, maybe, where pitchforks start coming out, maybe. And I think even the people who call this stuff socialism need to pay attention to how far they can stretch the inequalities in the economy. And the fact that, and this is the progressive coming out of me, I guess, the fact that the system is pretty well rigged in favor of the people who have the power to rig it. So it's an issue that we have to attend to. And I think not as the primary issue of COVID, certainly, or climate change, but I think we need solutions that address those equity problems as well as the environmental and the job problems.
I'd like to go through a few questions. We're running out of time, and so just a few questions, a little bit more quickly here. We were talking before we got online with the whole group here about the Democratic Party coming together on climate policy. Do you think that there will be congealing before the election or right after the election if Biden wins on the climate policy, or will there be 4 different bills that are introduced and everybody will duke it out for the first 6 months of the administration?
Well, this is not my party. I'm still a Republican, even if it's an iteration of republicanism that scarcely exists anymore. You'll see if you look behind me at the poster board I've got up there, that's Nelson Rockefeller's 1968 campaign poster. So I'm not a native of the Democratic Party, but my own sense of this is that Democrats have to address climate change in a first Biden term. There's no getting around it. The climate community is too critically important to their coalition, and they're going to have to deliver something. But you also can't have make-a-wish policies. Even if the Democrats take the Senate, Mitch McConnell is going to have nearly 50 votes. He's going to have filibuster power, and you can only pass things under that world, even if you get around the filibuster power, with Joe Manchin signing on, John Tester signing on, John Hickenlooper signing on, Christine Sinema signing on, whoever replaces maybe Joni Ernst or Tom Tillis in North Carolina signing on. So, these ideas that, oh my God, Biden needs to be more ambitious. I mean, what kind of world do you live in? I mean, the Senate is not going to have 60 votes for progressives to steamroll anything. And the boundaries of what can be done will be established by Joe Manchin, who's by no means a climate hawk. Maybe he's for better policy than most Republicans, but he's your boundary line. I expect that they will pass all that they can, and most of this is going to be done via administrative action by the EPA, which again has to run through the gauntlet of federal courts. And it will be done again through budget reconciliation, where we may have spending on stimulus, spending on industrial policy, both things I'm in favor of. But how far you can go there is again going to be defined by moderate Democrats in fossil fuel states.
So, Bill, do you think the Democrats are going to come together?
I think they have to, even if they just go for the low-hanging fruit first and get onto the contentious stuff a little bit later. But they're going to have to produce something. And by low-hanging fruit, I don't mean meaningless things. There are things like extending the solar tax credits and the wind tax credits and the EV tax credits that they can do that make some sense. But there's no question, Jerry's right. We still have the polarity. We're still going to get it. And a lot depends on what the voters say, I think. If the Republicans or any politicians believes that the voters are strong enough about this and willing to vote about this, that it jeopardizes their jobs, then I think we'll see a little bit more reasonableness. But we'll see if the voters come out in force and send a message on climate change.
Jerry, let's go back to your thing about Trump loses and the Democrats still have, if not total control of the Senate, 51 seats, but they have 48 or whatever. If McConnell is still in there, and let's say he does have control of the Senate, do you think he'll filibuster climate action, or do the Republicans break on this issue at some point?
It's too difficult to say with great confidence how Republicans respond to a blue wave in November if that blue wave were to come. It could play out in many different ways. They might decide that they may tell themselves a story. They were on the path to reelect Donald Trump and hold the Senate until COVID came. And it wasn't their fault COVID came. COVID was an exogenous event out of the blue, and it just messed up their policies, and they were on the right path with Donald Trump, and they're not going to get off that path. And part of that path was a ferocious anti-elite denialism on climate change. There's no reason to change. It may very well be that Mitch McConnell's not all that interested in that conversation, but he knows how to deal with the Democratic administration and how to knock it out, because they did that with Barack Obama. Obama had 2 years with governing power until 2010's midterm, and that was it. And then for 8 years, Barack Obama was stymied by a Republican majority in the House. So McConnell knows how to do that. And how did he do that? Absolute total opposition to every single thing the Democrats move. Will that be the way that Republicans go? Quite possibly. But on the other hand, if the Republicans really get creamed, or at least they believe they've gotten creamed, and they're looking at their demographics and saying, look, the rural white vote's just not going to ever return us to power. We've got to change. Then it may very well be the party splits into factions. The dominant part may always be Trumpist, but a significant minority part of the party, which is trying to compete in these suburban districts, has to flip on climate. So it's very hard to say. The only thing I can say with great confidence is that the only prospect for significantly changing Republican electoral opinion, by that I mean the legislators and in the House and the Senate where they stand on climate, is to beat the living heck out of the Republican Party as it currently exists in cycle after cycle, because that's the only way to guarantee that the party reconsiders the path it's on. That's the way parties reconsider their past. They end up losing consistently. Not just one election, not just 2 elections, but multiple elections, 3 at the outside, or 3 at the very least. And that's what's required. It pains me to say it as a Republican. I'm not a Democrat, but if we want Trumpism and denialism and the hard new right to lose strength in this party and thus lose strength in the climate debate, they have to lose consistently.
So last question for me, and then I'll ask you to make a little quick closing statement, but I just wanted to go to the public health issue here. COVID has, I think, shown that we have not invested adequately in public health here. We're just not prepared at all. Climate change is much the same way. We're not investing in preventative measures or preparedness or anything with that. Do you think we can link the public health issue, the justice issue, to climate change and use it to help drive that issue forward, or are those connections tenuous?
I think we need to make the public health linkage. There is a link, legitimate link between climate change and communicable diseases and changing disease vectors and all that kind of thing. We need to prepare for those changes as well as we prepare for climate change and how we did not prepare for COVID. So I think that's another, I don't think it's the main issue, but it's an important issue to bring up, that we're going to see more of this. And by the way, I think this pandemic probably was not a black swan. We've had these before. We knew they would have them again in an interconnected world. And we need to make that point in regard to the changes we're going to see with climate change. We hear the medical profession talking about the movement, the migration of animals in, to follow the, get away from the heat, for example. The migration of animals that carry some of these vectors or carry some of these viruses. So there is a body of evidence to suggest that climate change has a very legitimate public health impact, and I think it needs to come out.
Jerry, you want to comment on that, or would you like to just share? We've got just a couple minutes left, and if we could, you're talking to 50, 60 professionals out there that are concerned about climate change and want to know what they should do. Do you have any advice for them?
Well, two things. First of all, for people to hear about the importance of dealing with climate change from non-traditional spokesmen is important. So in other words, if a voter, runs across a Greenpeace volunteer who knocks on their door and they're talking about the need for climate change, probably has less impact than if their local minister or their doctor or their other civic organization that's not, obviously some, green activist group says this stuff's really important. This is important for us. That has a lot of impact, I think, on how people think about this issue, and which is one of the reasons I'm such a big fan of what you're doing, Bob, with ecoAmerica, because that's what you're in the business of. So that does have an impact. And when it comes to talking to Republicans, again, I'm less interested in trying to convince your uncle, Uncle Jim, who's a climate denialist, to give up the crazy and come to Jesus, as it were, than I am in talking to a Republican legislator. And one thing I've noticed is that one of the most effective organizations out there in dealing with Republican legislators is a group called Citizens Climate Lobby. And when they go to the Hill 3 or 4 times a year to meet with Republican office holders and Democrats too. When they meet with the Republicans, they don't don, a progressive garb. They're very respectful. I can't count the number of Republican legislators who went from disinterest or agnosticism on climate change to curiosity and conversations because they had respectful meetings with people that they didn't expect to have respectful meetings with, and people didn't insult them and attack them. I mean, for a lot of Republicans, think about a legislator who says, well, a Republican legislator wants to deal with climate action. Is he going to get the votes from people he might not otherwise have gotten? Well, in a lot of Republican minds, the people who care about climate change are also people who care about universal health care. They're the people who care about raising taxes and addressing inequality. They're the people who care about an entire list of Democratic agenda items that this Republican legislator is never going to meet. So is he or she going to peel away, enviro votes from progressives who might? Well, we don't think that's going to happen much. So meeting with Republican legislators and staff and being respectful and non-ideological and non-confrontational and not asking how much money they got from the Kochs and, exactly when their deal was made with Satan, that actually goes a long way too.
Thank you, Jerry. I think that's good. Bill?
Yeah, Jerry speaks truth. I agree with everything he just said, including Bob, and compliment to you and your organization. I think I think people do need to go to their own circle of trusted advisors and listen less to the Fox News people. But if you are one of those out there, trusted advisors, please be a rational, calm, but authoritative voice on this in telling people that this is an issue. And I would say, Bob, people ought to turn to your website because you've got a number of insights that I think you've gathered from some of your members on what the message should be. Timing matters, preparation matters, science and facts matter, leadership matters, honesty matters, individuals matters, the environment matters, seize the moment. Those are really, really insightful pieces of advice. And I would encourage everybody to look at them and speak them.
Well,
Entirely, Bill, those were that, and Bob, those were, that's an excellent document on your website.
It is.
I was just doing some focus groups in Southwest Florida with white suburban women, and we asked them where they got their news from, and only 30% got it from television or radio. 70% of it, they get their news from their friends, from their pastors, from the social circles, or husbands. And so all of us, with everyone that we talk to, can be like a pebble in a pond and spread out waves of knowledge and confidence, because another part of our research says that about 25% of people think, 54% of people say that they are very concerned about climate change. But when you ask them, are other people very concerned? Again, it's less than half of that number, because they're just not seeing people out there talking about it. But so Bill, Jerry, thanks so much for joining us as our guest speakers today. Your work and wisdom is inspiration to all of us. We are at the end of our time here, but the topic has elicited some great conversation, a lot of great questions that we didn't get to, and we will try to get back to all of you with answers to those questions. Please stay in touch with us. This is a weekly series on climate change, and next week we're going to what we call our nature and science channel, and we're going to be talking about nature versus COVID-19, how nature can provide security, love, and restoration, with 3 great panelists. One of them, full disclosure here, being my wife. So please join us. It's going to be at 3 p.m. next week, not at the usual 1 p.m. And again, continue to engage with us on Let's Talk Climate hashtag. And then from all of us at ecoAmerica, thank you very much. And join me in caring for our climate to protect our health, to protect our all Americans, and stay safe and stay well. Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.